Perfect. So welcome to the third OpenChain webinar. Today is very full. We're going to have contribution policies covered by Tobie. We're going to have M&A with Leon and Tony, and we're going to have due diligence with Andrew. So in around an hour, we're going to squeeze in everything you need to know about how you contribute outwards if you wish to, and how you approach contextualized open source M&A and due diligence, particularly with a filter regarding our industry standard. After we finish the webinar, this call will continue for 20 minutes further, where we'll have Mark Giese, chair of the specification, talk about the next generation of the OpenChain standard. This is not because we're releasing the next generation in the near term. It's because we're going to have the editing process in place so that when the existing standard goes through ISO and starts to go deep into procurement, that we can have the feedback in a structured way to talk about where OpenChain goes next, looking at the horizon a few years down the line. But let's get started. Tobie, shall I hand over the screen share to you for your presentation on contribution policies which don't suck?
That sounds great. Sorry for the title, people.
Let me pass the screen share over to you.
Let me get the presentation started on my side. And oh wait, I have to do this the other way around. There's always this sort of like weird dance that you do. So I should be able to share this. And then if I now put it full screen, can you see it full screen? Wonderful. Okay, yeah, great. So, well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm going to try to squeeze this into a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes, so I'll be kind of going fast. So, the first question that comes to mind when we talk about open source policies is whether or not you actually have one. And what's interesting is when you actually ask that question to corporations, or to developers working for corporations, you get this kind of like very concerning answer, which is close to a good half don't have an open source contribution policy. About 40% say that they do, and 13% just don't even know, right? So it's important to also take into account that the sample that from which this data comes from is very biased, because it is a survey that was done in collaboration with the Linux Foundation and the To-Do group. So, with groups of corporations that are used to contribute to open source that know what the Linux Foundation is. So, that's kind of quite concerning. Of course, if you go with really small companies, less than 250 employees, you increase the percentage of companies that do not have an open source policy at all. And thankfully, the bigger company you go to, the more you will see written down open source contribution policies. But again, remember that this is a biased sample, right? So the question then comes, well, what does not having a policy actually mean? And the answer to that is, of course, that the fact that you do not have a written policy does not mean that you don't actually have one, right? And so that is, starts to be an interesting way to look at open source contribution policies in terms of, do you actually have one, and then, or not? Like, is it explicit or is it implicit? And then on another sort of axis, how permissive is it, if at all? And if you look on the contrary, what does actually having a policy mean? Like, is that like sufficient in itself? Well, it turns out that you can have an open source policy, but it can be, for example, extremely restrictive. It can be super bureaucratic. It can be very opaque. And so it is not because you have a policy that it's necessarily a good one. So if we actually graph this on two axes, as I was suggesting before, you have on the vertical axis a notion of, is your policy implicit or explicit? And on the x-axis, how restrictive is it, or how permissive it is. Let's put a few type of companies on this graph to see what that means. Small and medium enterprise tends to be quite permissive about like contributing and using open source. but most of it is implicit. Like it's very little is actually written down. Startups tend to be very product focused, will have usually less of a footprint in open source, and so tend to be, have even less written down than small companies have, but be more restrictive in how they actually allow employees to work in open source, because they're essentially focused on working on the product. Non-tech enterprise, well, you're very much in the restrictive category, and often that's kind of implicit. There's not necessarily a lot written down. If you move towards sort of older tech companies, you'll find that they're restrictive about this, but they're actually more knowledgeable, and so they will actually be more explicit about how their employees can use and contribute back to open source. Of course, if you look at a patent troll, right, they would be very much in the super restrictive and super explicit part of that graph. Now, moving to more modern tech companies, you will find increasingly, and if you're part of the OpenChain group, that you understand the value of doing this, that you want to be both more explicit and also tend towards more permissive. And if you go at the vanguard, the trendsetters, you will obviously find them in the top right hand, in the first quadrant, being super explicit, super permissive. What's interesting is to see the kind of how a company is going to change as it grows from a startup to becoming a bigger company, right? As it grows, it's going to become more permissive. More engineers are going to join the company, and they will start contributing to open source, maybe using open source of some of their products more clearly. And there's a point, could be during an acquisition, could be during a seed, some form of funding round, where the company will actually go to a council and say, well, can you, what's the story here? Are we doing the things that we need to do properly? And the huge risk at this point is to, as it grows, become clearly a lot more explicit, but also be a lot more restrictive in the way it thinks about open source as a company. So what you want instead, right, is explicitness to come with at least the same amount of permissiveness. Similarly, if you look at old tech companies, for example, a really good example that I use often is Microsoft. That used to be very much in the explicitly restrictive category. You will see it having done the kind of path from being explicitly restrictive to being increasingly permissive about how open source is handled by its employees. For non-tech enterprise, the risk was all of the compliance work that's being done around open source is to have them become, again, more explicit, but stay in the restrictive category, whereas what you'd want them to do is, as they're cleaning their act, as they're getting their act together in terms of explicitness, actually also join that first quadrant, while basically all of the tech companies and trendsetters are right now. So this is where you want to be, right? Let's now look at what exactly do we want in a policy that doesn't suck. And we're going to look at that from an engineering perspective, from a legal perspective, and from a business perspective, right? So from an engineering perspective, what you want is essentially a policy that is permissive, because actually being able to contribute to open source without having to go through long negotiation with the legal part of the company is something that most engineers and most engineering organizations want to be able to do. It has to be explicit, so it has to be clear what needs to happen and when. It has to be informative, right? You can't just disallow things without also educating engineers about why it's disallowed, because that creates distrust between legal and engineering, and conflict if they're there's just a no that comes, no, you cannot contribute to this, or no, you cannot use this software, without actually educating the engineers on the reason for that. And lastly, you want such a policy to be as frictionless as possible, right? It has to be really easy for engineering to ask permission to contribute to a particular project or use a particular piece of open source. From a legal perspective, and so just a disclaimer here, I'm not a lawyer, so obviously this is my interpretation of the legal perspective. If you have comments to make here, I'm more than happy to hear them. So essentially, what you want from a policy, from a legal perspective, is minimizing risk, right? You don't want to accidentally give away competitive advantage. You want to be careful about reputational damages, infringements, etc., right? You want this policy to be consistently followed across the company. You want to be savvy about written information, right? So for example, for compliance, you want to have a paper trail. On the other hand, because of like some of, triple damages around patents, for example, you want to be careful not to leave a paper trail for other questions. And so that's also something that legal tends to care about. And I think most importantly is you don't want the legal department to drown in the sea of menial issues and sort of lose touch of what the critical problems are as a result. From a business perspective, what do you want? Well, you want engineering to be happy, productive, and innovative. You want minimizing risk. You want good communication between legal and engineering. And most importantly, you want alignment of your open source policy with your business goals. And if you think about like why having a good policy is so difficult, it's because there was a very strong tension with the role and practices of legal and engineering in an organization. Legal will want to minimize risk, whereas engineering would want to maximize velocity. Legal tends to prefer oral communication, engineering written asynchronous communication. Legal is often on a manager's schedule, engineering on a maker's schedule. Legal tends to think, law in general is more of like a spectrum thinking with lots of gray area, whereas engineering is still mostly essentially binary. Everything is black or white, right? The role of legal in the company is to be conservative, the role of engineering to be innovative. So how do you come to agreements between these two groups? Well, first of all, you acknowledge that this tension is normal. It's just checks and balances, right? That's the whole point of having a legal department and an engineering department. They have different roles within the same company, and both are valid. And basically what you want to do is align them on common business goals, right? And really make it clear that if you find common ground, in a good policy will improve the life of both sides. So I think those are really like the key aspects, is that both can really benefit from having a better policy. All right, so let's quickly look at what an open source policy really is about. The first two things you'll find in an open source policy is using open source and contributing to open source. So quickly, the using open source part is really the realm of OpenChain. It's about compliance, etc. And this is less, it's not really the area that I focus on. So I really want us to look at the other side today, which is the contributing to open source aspect. I have an interesting effect loop here. Apologies for this. Let me quickly move into the slides that are after this. So when you look at contributing to open source, the first thing that comes to mind is you can contribute to open source at work or on your free time. And if we look first of all of what happens on your free time outside of work, that's an interesting question, is can employees contribute to open source on their free time? And if we ask that question, we have like very different answers depending on whom we ask. It can be yes without asking for permission. It can be absolutely, but they must ask for permission, so that sometimes means no. And unfortunately, a lot of the times, the kind of answer that you get is, I don't know, or no. So this was a question that was actually asked in 2017 to contributors of open source projects on GitHub. And again, some pretty terrifying answers, if in my opinion, which is, whereas close to 50% may contribute to open source on their free time, you'll find that close to 40%, so 37% of contributors to open source projects actually don't know whether they're allowed to do that or not. Right? So obviously, when you talk about compliance, this is a very concerning data point, because you can comply with the license all you want. If the contributors actually didn't comply with their own legal requirement, that creates potential issues. Right? And again, this is a highly biased sample because it's a sample of contributors to open source project. If you ask that at a broader scope, you probably have a lot more I don't knows, right? So this is like the best outlook that we have on this. So why is there so much confusion around this? Well, the lawyers around among you all know that, like jurisdiction, there's different rules depending on jurisdiction of who owns the IP. Some have own unpaid production 24/7. Sometimes that's not the case, but if you do it on company equipment or not, that can matter who the contribution belongs to. So there's a lot of lack of clarity here. And let me skip that one. And so for me, one of the really interesting aspects here is the balanced employee IP agreement that GitHub started with their own employees and open sourced, which is an agreement that makes it super clear and really easy for their employees to contribute to open source and have the company only claim control of creations made for or relating to the company's business. So if we look at contributing at work, we basically have really two different aspects of this. One is releasing software that has been built internally, and the other one is patching. So let's look at releasing first, right? So what's important here is to make a distinction, first of all, between large projects and really small ones. For example, Google has a rule that every project which is less than 100 lines of code doesn't have to go through like a formal process to be approved, right? So that makes it really easy for developers to be able to release scaffolding code or example code without having to go through a formal process. For other kinds of projects, what you want is a well-documented process. There's a lot of really good information for that in the To-Do group, and I really encourage you to have a look at this. If you're the OSPO, what you want is to provide help. And another thing that I think is super valuable is to promote working in the open as much as possible. It's actually a lot easier to start on a project with a README than to actually go through the whole process of making sure that there isn't committed code in a project that can't be public, etc. Right? So that's another thing that you want to consider is promoting working in the open first. Patching. Patching is the most common activity that developers do nowadays, right? This is even more true now that you have, for example, client-side code, which is extremely heavy on external dependencies, right? So it's very common to fix a number of different modules during a single day, and you want to make that process as frictionless as possible. One of the good things to do here is to cache decisions, right? So you create approve and deny lists of what you have agreed to in the past. You might also even make decisions based on certain categories of licenses, for example. So to summarize, if you look at what's in a good open source contribution policies, it will be split between using open source on one side and contributing to open source on the other. In the contributing to open source part, you want to divide it into what's outside of work and what's at work. And in the at work part, you want to make processes for releasing open source software well documented, well oiled, and have an OSPO, an open source programs office that is there to help as much as possible. And on the other hand, you want to make patching as easy and as smooth a process as possible. Lastly, and I will, this is what I will finish with, is you can actually turn your policy into an app or into services, right? All of what we described, our decision tree was caching pre-decisions. This is typically what software is really good at doing. Adobe was actually implemented such a system a while back. And what's super interesting is that we're able to shorten the review time from basically a week to half a day, right? That was the review time for open source projects that were complicated. Most of the other ones were just the decision had happened in the past, was cached, and the answer, the approval was instant for engineers that wanted to contribute to it. The benefit of that is obviously if you've built this into an app or service, you can actually start gathering data, and that data can then help you understand your open source activity better, promote these activities, connect engineers that are working on similar projects without being aware of that, et cetera, right? So there's a whole slew of additional benefits to doing this. And with this, I have finished running through my slides. And if we have the time, I'm happy to take a few questions. And if we don't, well, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tobie. Time is tight, but we do want to make sure people have time to ask questions. As we said on previous webinars, you should think of this like a radio show with guests. And you're already dialed in on the phone line. So if you have any questions or comments, they're very welcome. With that, we'll pause for a second and see if anyone wants to jump in. Well, all right. Thank you very much indeed, Tobie. Covered a lot of ground, and contribution policies. Pardon?
You're most welcome.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, sorry.
Not at all. It was great of you to join. Contribution policies are always a hot topic, especially when, for instance, some companies don't want to have proactive contribution. And there's the important issue that if that's the case, you need to know exactly why, and you need to document it. Okie dokie. So if you can end your screen share, and we will prepare to move on to the next speakers. We've got Leon and Tony about open source in M&A, hot topic. This is something that keeps coming up when we are dealing with aspects of business outside of procurement. So Leon, over to you.
Great, thanks very much. I hope you can see the screen.
Yeah, looking good.
All right, cool. Then Tony, I will let you start.
Great. Thanks, and you guys can hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Perfect. All right, great. Thanks, Leon. Tobie, thanks for the great talk as well. And Shane, thanks for having us. And I guess everyone who's tuning in, thanks for tuning in. So today we're going to have a very brief introduction to the impact that open source software can have on a transaction. We'll focus on M&A, and we'll have a few key tie-ins to OpenChain. And I say very brief, since if there's interest from the group, we're happy to come back for kind of the longer version of this. We have a 1 hour version, and even for that, we have to move, really quickly through it. And, before I dive in, I wanted to give a little background on ourselves and our experience, because it helps to, understand our viewpoint and kind of, our take and why we know these things kind of about the way this plays out in a transaction. So Leon and I are active in the computer code audit and due diligence group at GTC. We're a US-based law firm, and we focus on IP strategy and IP-centric transactions. And we've been fortunate over the years to, on the one hand, represent a lot of kind of serial large Fortune 500 acquirers in the software and hardware space, as well as VCs and PE firms. And on the other side, we've helped many startups and mid-sized companies kind of grow and get acquired. So we're kind of well positioned to see these issues from all sides of the table. And we've gained insight into a lot of companies and their open source practices. We've probably looked at hundreds of companies over the years, including in relation to transactions, and probably reviewed the results of thousands of code scans. So that's kind of the sort of perspective we're bringing to this. And you kind of see the topics we'll hit on briefly up there, on the slide. We're going to try to, go from the perspective of both the seller and the buyer. On the prior slide, the seller was the hoodie-wearing person there. It's probably what a lot of us look like these days. And the buyer investor was the suit-wearing person, which is maybe what some of us used to look like in the past. So before, we dive into the risks, and Leon, I guess you can go to number 3, please. Thanks. We thought we'd start by just saying, we wanted to clarify, we love open source. So, for at least the reasons on this slide, so we wanted to get that out there because a lot of what we end up focusing on, as lawyers on a transaction are the risks and the possible negative impacts that open source can have on your transaction. So we wanted to get that out there because, a lot of what you'll hear in our talk and on the longer talk is really focused on risks and sort of negative things. And we're not saying these risks are necessarily real, they're not necessarily material, or they're not even probable in a given case. But on a transaction, these sorts of risks really tend to get amplified. One of the best things about working on a transaction is sort of the cross-functional team you get covering, many different specialties. But this also means that key decision makers, might not be well versed in open source. So when someone hears on a deal there's a possible outcome that some component that's being used is under a license that could require you, to share the proprietary source code they're buying, no matter how remote that risk is, it can receive, a lot of attention on a deal. So, we're looking at this with, that lens too. So you have to kind of, think about that and the probabilities sort of kind of go by the wayside sometimes, on a transaction. So I'll pass over to Leon to kind of go through some of the risks that we see on transactions.
Hey, thanks, Tony. Typically, for those of you listening, typically when Tony and I do this, I sort of play the role of the good guy seller that wants to do everything well, and Tony plays the role of the bad guy buyer. So we made sure that he had the "We love open source" slide just so that he gets that for once. So being the bad guy, types of open source risk, like Tony mentioned, there is risk associated with open source, as with everything in life. So the first is really license and compliance risk, and really open source licenses are no different from commercial licenses. So breach can cause termination, and that leads to claims of infringement. The difference is that with open source, you don't often get a cure period to your breach. Security risks, this is also true that open source software is inherently not any less secure than closed source software. It's just that there's much more open source being used in development. And as I'm sure we all know, folks aren't always very good at keeping track of it. So you end up with security holes that you're not necessarily aware of. For business risk, what we really are talking about here is that if you know what you're using, then you can sort of avoid being stuck building on top of projects that go dormant or ones that have gotchas associated with your competitors. So for example, Facebook's famous patent license add-on for React.js, which they still use, by the way, for some projects, just not for React.js. Remediation risk is sort of self-explanatory. Really, it costs money and time to fix issues. So the sooner you catch them, the better off you are. And then there's recent enforcement litigation, right? So you've got people like Patrick McCarty, who's probably the world's very first copyright troll, and his enforcement actions to companies that sue each other and then leverage open source related claims in those lawsuits. So instead of enforcement actions that are mainly brought by sort of organizations that are interested in making sure that everybody plays nice, there's money at stake. And so that's sort of what we're seeing now. I want to talk a little bit about the types of transactions. We talk a lot about M&A, but really it's important to remember that this applies to all sorts of transactions. We've had underwriters working on IPOs ask us questions, and we've had rep and warranty insurers either want to carve out open source entirely or ask for results of code scans. So Tony mentioned at the top that we'll very, very briefly talk about sort of 3 of the stages of the transaction, but really that's a bit of a misnomer because the work starts before the transaction does. So when you're planning for the future, when you're planning for the transaction, whether you're likely to be a buyer or a seller, the first step is to learn about open source, its impact and how to deal with that impact. And of course, OpenChain is a great resource for this, lots of material that you can use there. If you're likely to be a seller, you should essentially put yourself through the diligence you will be put through in a transaction. And then that lets you clean everything up, and it lets you make sure that you're in compliance, and to do it sort of not on deal timing, but on real world timing, which is sometimes better. Implement your open source policies, show that you're following them. So as Tobie just pointed out, it's important to have a policy for contributing. It's important to have a policy for using open source as well. And if your policy that you send over during a transaction is so new that it was developed an hour before you sent it, then that's not really going to make anyone feel very good about your preparedness. Prepare your materials, notice files, bills of material, license and usage information, anything that you think you might be asked to provide, have it ready, and then build your team. The people that help you with this diligence work are probably going to be good candidates to help you during a deal. Now, on the other hand, if you're the buyer, you should probably start with building your team. So have legal help lined up, and that's either in-house or specialist. Have your other providers lined up. So code scan vendors, make sure you have license agreements with them that you've worked out. Work with your legal counsel to determine your risk tolerances. So what are you going to do for distributed LGPL, for example, right? Cover the gray areas. Then develop a plan for how you'll conduct the diligence. You will very likely not have enough time to review everything. So it's important to know both what and how to prioritize your review. And finally, make sure that your agreement terms are up to date to match what you plan to do in diligence and to match your sort of open source takes, because we find that it's a lot easier to have open source related provisions in your agreements from the word go, rather than trying to then insert them later. So now I mentioned the due diligence process on the last slide. We could do a talk about this for about an hour, maybe 2, perhaps a whole day. But at a very high level, there are 2 things about a good diligence process, and they are both fairly well, I think, represented by this picture here. Number 1 is there are 3 phases. You identify, you analyze, and then you plan and remediate. And number 2 is that it's an iterative process. So it's not something that you just do once and then forget about it. As new components are added to your code base, you got to keep the process going. And then the third stage of the transaction that we want to talk about a little bit today is to negotiate the actual agreement between the parties. And on this slide, we have some of the common provisions that we use to account for open source and commercial third-party software. It's important to keep sort of in the back of your head thinking that there really is no difference for inbound software in terms of how you treat it in the agreement. So a scheduling rep is used to make sure that the information provided during diligence was true and complete. You're relying on it as the buyer, so that's something that should be in there. The substantive rep can be as simple as no bad open source, though we do tend to use some pretty nifty legalese to say it rather than just saying that. And then, of course, you can get into much more intricate language that really depends on the situation, the product, the use case, and of course, leverage, right, depending on who has what. Covenants and closing conditions, we use them to make sure the work you're doing is completed, whether that's the review or the remediation to whatever degree is needed. And finally, of course, indemnification provisions and escrow are used to make the other provisions have teeth, which is kind of important. Now, before I hand this back to Tony to wrap us up, I did want to mention one more thing. As I think we've both now said, this talk is typically one we schedule for about an hour, and we usually have to talk real quick to get through it. So we are obviously not covering things in a great level of detail here, but see this as sort of the appetizer, and we hope that you're still hungry, because we'll do the full length one of these and sort of cover all of the aspects of the transactions from both the seller and and the buyer side. And now I'll hand it back to Tony to sort of bring us home here.
You know, I'll say too, when we do the deeper dive, if folks are interested, you know, we can talk about how OpenChain fits in for many of these phases of the transaction. You know, I'll talk about it a little in a minute, but you can really leverage OpenChain compliance to, you know, help with your deal diligence as a buyer to know kind of what to ask for, and on the sell side, you know, to speed things up and have the buyer go, you know, easier on you. So let me kind of just talk a little bit about just kind of the impact on the overall sort of impact, you know, on the transaction. So we'll talk about kind of like the macro impacts on the left here first. So one impact you can see is an impact on timing. You can actually have open source issues create delay. They might delay the signing of your transaction. So there could be remediation that needs to be completed, and it's a type that the buyer might want done before they'll even sign the deal. You know, maybe it's very uncertain from a technical point of view, so they want to make sure, you know, you have this done. It can also impact your closing. So typically, you know, a deal signs and there's some period of time, you know, 30, 60, 90 days before it actually closes and the money changes hands. In that time period, there's usually a schedule of things that have to be completed, some of which is often open source remediation. So if you can't get it done, you know, it might actually pull out your closing, push out your closing. So that kind of delays when you take ownership of the company and when on the sell side you get your money. It can also impact price. So we see deals sometimes where like the cost of remediation or like the estimated cost of some sort of non-compliance, you know, if there's a risk of a lawsuit, can actually hit the purchase price. And usually there's like a multiplier for the uncertainty, because you can't estimate the remediation or the liability with any certainty. So there's usually a premium for the unknown. So it's something to think about that, you know, your practices here can actually have dollar consequences. We see this also impact deal certainty. So whether or not your transaction is actually going to get done. You know, sometimes you might have a remediation condition that you need a waiver or a clarification of license rights from some third party, but now you have like a third party who's in control of your deal, and they don't have any incentive to kind of get that to you on any time frame. You know, in rare cases too, it can actually kill the deal. You know, you don't see this very often. We've definitely seen it happen a couple times in the last, you know, decade and a half we've been doing this, but you can see it upset the build versus buy decision. Like sometimes the remediation effort or the timeline is so long or extensive that it might make sense just to build this yourself or, you know, buy it from someone else. You know, moving to the middle panel, this is where OpenChain can have a huge impact, I think. You know, like if you have a process in place, you can provide the information that's required in diligence. You're going to have a lot of artifacts that your compliance with the spec, the OpenChain spec, will spin out that you can reuse in the transaction. And it'll probably reduce the amount of effort and time required to get this done. And if you're on the sell side and you can say, you know, you're OpenChain certified, you might get the buyer to back off, you know, in many respects. And I'll say too on this slide, you know, no one wants any of these things to happen. So like if something goes off the rails, it's frustrating for the seller, it's frustrating for the buyer. You know, nobody wants to put effort and time into a transaction and then just have it, you know, not go through. So it's really not that people are trying to be opportunistic here and search for issues and use them sort of against you. It's really collaborative. They're just trying to, you know, understand what they're buying, and the seller's trying to show the value of what they're selling, and that there's not, you know, issues in this area. So you can be very like strategic in your use of open source. And Leanne, actually, if you can go to the next, thank you. Yeah. So you can go really a lot, you know, beyond compliance when you're thinking about open source. So there's a tendency for people doing open source diligence on a transaction to kind of check the box and say, okay, you know, are all the licenses permissive? Or for the ones that aren't, you know, is there a usage scenario that makes sense, that everybody's in compliance? But you can actually leverage this area, you know, a lot more than just focusing, you know, on compliance. And you're spending a lot of money and time to do this, you might as well get more, you know, out of it. So one way is, you might get some additional insurance on your deal. You know, on the buy side, you might have reps and warranties, indemnification, escrow, you know, money put aside that could really function as, you know, an insurance policy. You can use this in your transaction to create some leverage. You know, on the buyer side, you know, let's say, you know, you do a code scan and it finds things that the company didn't know about. You might be able to leverage that on your deal to say that, you know, they didn't understand their code, and you can, you know, try for more onerous deal terms. On the sell side, if you had clean code, you're OpenChain compliant, for example, you can probably avoid a code scan altogether. And maybe your reps are limited to just conformance with the specification, as opposed to all the detailed reps you might get. You can also use it to control the deal process. That's a big part of any deal, is the process. So you can use this to control the timing. On the sell side, if you can make open source a non-conversation, you can really use that to your advantage. You can also use it for sort of concessions. Not everything that you find is a really big issue, but the other side might not know that. So you might be able to have, 1 or 2 points in this area you're willing to concede and sort of trade for other things. So it can be useful there. And then finally, it can just help with your overall deal terms. You might be able to get materiality qualifiers added, so you're not, absolutely making statements. You're just saying, it's materially true. Or if you really know your code, maybe you can get knowledge qualifiers put in there. Or on the flip side, if you don't know your code and your open source house is a mess, maybe you're not going to get those things, on your deal. And sometimes too, we've seen folks get better premiums for rep and warranty insurance. And something we're hoping to see in the future is once OpenChain's ISO, in addition to sometimes they want a code scan to give you insurance on your deal, maybe an OpenChain ISO certification could function as well to impact the premiums. We quickly flew through that. We are happy to come back and do the longer version of this. And Shane, I want to give Andrew enough time. We're happy to take questions, but I'm also just watching the clock.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Tony and Leon. Okay, so we are running tight on time, but we will run over the hour if necessary to ensure that, for example, Andrew's presentation has time and additional questions at time. Let's just throw open the floor. One of the things that has been asked for both Tobie and yourselves is, will the slides be available after the talk?
Sure. You can, yeah, definitely.
All right, cool. I'll make sure that that's shared with the community at large. Tobie, how about on your end? Can we share your slides?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I replied in the chat, but yes, absolutely. I'll send you a link.
Thanks very much indeed. Okay, so any other questions for Tony and Leon? All right, let's zoom on. Andrew, it's time for due diligence.
Right, let's see how we can get this thing to work. Okay.
Yep, it's sharing perfectly.
You can see it, right? Okay, so if right, can you see that?
Perfect.
Excellent, excellent. Brilliant. Well, thanks very much, Shane. And Tobie, first of all, thank you for your presentation. And Leon and Tony, thank you for yours as well. I was a little bit apprehensive that I would either be repeating a certain amount of what Tony and Leon were saying, or alternatively, I was going to go off in a completely wrong and inconsistent direction. But luckily, that appears not to be the case. So thank you very much indeed for that. What I wanted to talk about was how it's possible to use OpenChain, and in particular the specification, as a framework for M&A transactions. And as you can see, the format of this slide is designed to look a little bit like the curriculum. So if this is something that ultimately gets adopted by the OpenChain project, then it will be easy to slip this deck into the training materials. I'd also point out that this is in the process of development as well, as the particular internal project to do this only got started last week. So towards the end of the month, which I think is going to be 29th of May, but I will confirm that, I'm going to be giving a sort of longer hour-long talk about this. But this is just a sort of really high-level overview of what we're doing in terms of OpenChain and due diligence in M&A. So you'll have seen this slide before. I'm not going to go through that again. So let's talk a little bit about the M&A lifecycle and documents. I can go through this quite quickly because Leon and Tony also went through this. But essentially, the process involves, first of all, screening the target, then undertaking due diligence, which typically starts by the buyer sending a due diligence questionnaire out to the seller to get some information out about the target. And that due diligence questionnaire obviously covers, all areas of the business. It's related to tax affairs and employees and premises and general contracts and accounting and all sorts of things. So specifically, obviously, we're focusing on software, in particular open source software, as far as this particular case is concerned. But quite often, that is the primary asset of the target company. So one that the purchaser wants to focus on particularly carefully. Then the process gets executed. The transaction is executed, and then finally that leads to an integration process where the target gets integrated into the purchasers group. So what typically happens is, as a result of the due diligence questionnaire, that generates a whole bunch of answers being returned about the state of the company, etc. Then that will build into a whole bunch of warranties. I call them warranties because I'm talking about English law. Tony and Leon were talking about representations, but broadly speaking, representations and warranties can, in this context anyway, can be considered to be the same thing. So they're basically legal statements made about the target that, if they turn out to be untrue, they generate some form of legal remedy. And then coupled with that, if you make if a warranty, for example, could say something like, all tax filings have been made on a particular date, and it may be that one particular tax filing hasn't been made on a particular date. So there's always a disclosure letter. There are always disclosures, which is basically where the seller says, well, actually, we can't say that all of these things are true, so we're going to have to say, oops, we made a mistake here, or there's this particular thing that we need to draw to your attention. And then that will cause the cycle that Leon and Tony were talking about to take effect, which may have effects like it may cause a change in the price, in the extremis, in the price for the business, or it may cause further negotiation in terms of caps, indemnities, and so on and so forth. And then after all that has happened, then it obviously moves on to the integration phase, where the target gets integrated into the purchaser's business. So how does OpenChain help as far as the transaction documents are concerned? To give a little bit of context, obviously, as a corporate law firm, this is something that we have been involved in for a long time, is acquiring software companies, and in common with most law firms who specialize in this, we've developed our own set of internal precedents that enable us to streamline our own internal processes. And the precedents that I've developed in the past in terms of due diligence questionnaire, not surprisingly, as far as open source is concerned, they look very, very similar to the sort of things that you would see in a mature open source compliance process. Because basically, any company that is developing and selling open source is going to be a company, if it's run properly, is going to have some sort of compliance process and documentation in place. And not surprisingly, that process and documentation is ultimately going to look very similar to sort of process and documentation which you will find in the OpenChain specification. Right, that's no surprise. So it's occurred to us that it would probably be a worthwhile exercise, having already been through the process of using the OpenChain specification as the basis for creating an open source policy that's very closely mapped, so that if you look at a particular requirement of the specification, and this is all material that's available on the OpenChain project website, you'll be able to see that that generates a particular precedent policy statement. So it makes it very easy to map the OpenChain specification requirements directly onto an OpenChain policy. We decided, wouldn't it be interesting to see how well the OpenChain specification worked in the same way, using it as a framework to generate a set of open source M&A due diligence documents and other transaction documents. And the answer is that actually worked pretty well. So This is just some sort of background info on the slide at the moment. The only thing that I'm really going to focus on there is the fact that we believe that OpenChain compliance is going to play a growing role in M&A transactions because it really produces a reduction in friction for M&A transactions, and that's you know, exactly what Leon and Tony were talking about. So the issues with the existing approach is that quite often current legal practice does not reflect current development practice. Now, it's a dirty little secret of a lot of law firms that we subscribe to a number of services that will provide precedent documents I mentioned before. And one of these is PLC, which is Practical Law Company, which is a service provided by Thomson Reuters. Now, it's also the case that law firms that are particularly experienced in particular areas will also, as I mentioned before, have developed their own set of precedents, so they won't be using these standard precedents in their specialist areas. But many other law firms, you know, will be using these standard precedents, and there's quite an impressively large number of precedents on the Practical Law Company website. And I had a little look earlier on today to see what the precedents were that dealt specifically with M&A transactions relating to technology and software companies. So these aren't general transactions, these are specific transactions related to technology and software companies. And had a look at the questionnaire that they have on there, and it is incredibly lightweight. All it really asks for is a list of components, so essentially a bill of materials, and a set of licenses. And then there's a question in there that somebody's put in that basically says, oh, and are any of these components either copyleft components or do they link to copyleft components? And that's about it. So what do these questions not ask? Well, they don't ask about build environments. They don't ask about policies for code inclusion. They don't ask about any policies that might exist around training and awareness of those policies within the organization, you know, which would typically be the sort of questions that would be asked, for example, if you look at the due diligence questionnaire in relation to something like data protection policies, you would expect to have those particular questions. So it seems that these precedent services, they're very immature as far as their awareness and knowledge of open source and basically all software development is concerned. So they don't talk about roles and responsibilities within the software development process. They don't talk about compliance artifacts and the code policies that might exist for inbound and outbound. They don't talk about any existing compliance issues and what sort of history there's been. And they also don't take into account just the facts of modern software development. You know, we now have a situation where many software products will consist of many thousands of components all interacting with each other. So this idea that you can produce just a single bill of materials and get somebody to have a look at that, you know, is no longer effective. And okay, then you can start talking about source code scanning tools like black, dark, and white source and FOSS ID and so on. But that's only part of the story. It doesn't. They don't deal with the concepts of continuous integration and development. They don't deal with some of the special issues that arise as a result of container technology that the OpenChain seminars have been talking about very importantly recently. And they also don't talk about the target company's involvement and participation and code contribution in relation to open source projects. So if you want to suck all of that information in, if you want to try to find out how a company, the target company, reacts to all of these things, then it's actually very easy to create a due diligence questionnaire, which is based on the framework of the OpenChain specification. So for example, if we look at the specification requirement 331 in version 2.1 of OpenChain, it states that a written open source policy shall exist that governs open source license compliance of the supplied software, and the policy shall be internally communicated. So you can easily translate this into a due diligence questionnaire that asks the target to provide details and a copy of any relevant open source license compliance terms, etc., open source policy relating to that, and also details of an internal procedure, which is followed to ensure that. And then that can flow through as part of the transaction execution phase to a set of warranties that echo that at all. So the process that we're going through at the moment is to generate the due diligence questionnaire based on the OpenChain policy 2.1, and then also to produce a set of warranties that can be used as part of the transaction. Now, of course, as Leon and Tony mentioned, if you have a company that's already OpenChain compliant or goes into the process with OpenChain compliance, then it may be possible to limit the warranties to something much more straightforward that says that the company is, in respect of all software projects licensed by it to third parties, conformant with OpenChain specification 2.1. And of course, that warranty just doesn't just cover this particular due diligence issue. It covers the whole range of issues that are covered by the OpenChain specification. So just to take one other example, we can talk about something a lot more complicated in terms of trying to capture it as a warranty, which is the contribution policy. So 351 of the specification talks about the contribution policy. You can quite easily turn that into a due diligence question, which echoes that. And again, if you have a target that has reached conformance, you can see that the warranty that you're able to use is much more straightforward. So it results in a vast reduction in friction as far as the analysis of the OpenChain, of the open source software product is concerned. So what roadmap are we working to here? Well, we're working on creating a due diligence questionnaire and a sample set of warranties together with some basic training, and we will release these to the OpenChain project in common with the rest of the documentation by and large that's available. We'll make that available under CC0. And what we're quite keen to do is to make them available to other law firms and to cooperate and collaborate with other law firms, and also providers of precedent documents like LexisNexis and Thomson Reuters to try to make these become a standard within the domain of M&A with software companies that are producing open source software. So what are the benefits of doing this? Well, as we said, it reduces friction on due diligence and it potentially reduces the acquisition costs. It also means that a single compliance exercise within a target not only benefits that business's customers, because then they can go out and say to their customers, we're OpenChain compliant, makes life a lot easier to use. So that's part of the supply chain, but also obviously potential investors and purchasers. And as Leon and Tony said, there's also, it may help with things like the providers of insurance covering reps and warranties insurance. I've come across circumstances where it probably would have helped to have conversations with a regulator, for example, so it could help from a regulatory perspective as well. So one single activity, the implementation of an OpenChain compliance policy, can have benefits in any number of areas. And this would tend to lead to a virtuous circle where businesses and their advisors will become more familiar with and aware of OpenChain. It'll drive adoption of the OpenChain specification and standard. And where what we're doing at the moment is talking to a number of venture capitalists and saying to them, you should consider recommending and requiring that your investee companies become OpenChain compliant because of these particular benefits. And of course, when they divest, then it makes the transaction more straightforward in the future and has all these additional benefits. So that was an extremely high-speed romp through the work that we're doing at the moment in converting the OpenChain specification into a set of due diligence documentation and reps and warranties. So if we have time, I would be very, very happy to take any questions that anyone has.
Fantastic. There's one question that has been sent in from Jeff saying, how often are you seeing knowledge qualifiers?
So a knowledge qualifier, I could guess is I guess is when sorry, translating into English legal concepts here. So it says something like, to the extent that the target is aware X, Y, Z is the case. I mean, you will see a lot of those inserted into documents, and the idea really of trying to get conformance with the OpenChain specifications at an early stage is to try to get away from those so that it becomes really a source of knowledge and a knowledge of information about the bill of materials in a format that ultimately will be easily understandable, so that the risk analysis process ultimately is going to have to be largely automated. So you try to avoid relying on these knowledge qualifiers. It's much easier to be able to ask a question without a knowledge qualifier, such as is this bill of materials complete? so far as this specific project is concerned, right? Which is something that the target company should be able to answer yes or no, because they understand what the build process is, etc. And then you can do your due diligence process based on what you know to be in the bill of materials, rather than saying, having something along the lines of, to the extent that the target is aware, are there any problematic open source licenses in this list of components? Which is something that would be much more risky to rely on. So I hope that helps to answer the question.
Yeah, no, absolutely brilliant. Thank you, Andrew. And just opening the floor again, are there any further questions? Okay, everyone, we're wrapping up pretty much right on time on the hour. A big thank you to Tobie, who had to go to his next call, Leon and Tony and Andrew. We covered on this webinar some of the topics that have been appearing again and again. The fact is that contribution policies are an area of continual discussion and in some cases confusion, so it was great to have some notes on that. OpenChain is increasingly popping up in M&A discussions as a clear single way to assess how a company is doing open source. And in exactly the kind of area where Andrew mentioned with due diligence, we're seeing the potential for OpenChain to be one of the core aspects of open source due diligence. Very exciting that everyone's sharing their slides. Very exciting that Andrew's ramping up for a contribution on these slides. And I do hope that we can see collaboration with other law firms and consultancies on this matter. So we're going to end the webinar here, but we will be continuing for 20 minutes or so with a segue into another discussion. So I'm just going to start to share my own screen. And what we have here is a discussion on the OpenChain specification next-gen drafting.